Good morning, all of you. It's good to see you again and good to be back together here. And we're in Garland, aren't we? People keep saying Mesquite, but it's not. It's Garland where we are meeting here today, and glad to have the chance to be with you today. I owe this blessing to the fact that Mr. Ted Armstrong decided to go to San Antonio today. Otherwise, he probably would have been here. But he is down there. I'm pretty sure it's San Antonio. There was some confusion about whether he was going to San Antonio or Austin. I sincerely hope he went to the right place. But I think it's San Antonio where he is today. I do have some good news. We have, in the last week or so here, added a couple of television outlets. One of them is a little bit unusual. It's a satellite-only outlet. It is not being picked up by any cable programs across the country. But we had some people. It was funny. I was sitting here at my desk answering letters one day, and I came to a letter from a fellow in Montana who was moaning and groaning about KTVT having scrambled its signal. That's Channel 11 out of Dallas, because he was every Sunday morning getting up at 6 o'clock. In fact, I'm not sure where he was in Montana. If he was on Mountain Time, he was getting up at 5 o'clock to watch the program on KTVT out of Dallas here, Channel 11. And I was able to write back to him because I had just learned that morning that Benny had contracted with Westar 4 Satellite, Channel 6, for 9 o'clock on Sunday morning to carry the program. So we are on a satellite outlet which is not being picked up by any cable systems or any for rebroadcast anywhere, but it is there for anyone who has a satellite dish and can carry it. We think we're going to get a little side benefit from this in the fact that it can be used for cable distribution. In other words, the cable companies can pick up the signal off a satellite and then rebroadcast it, and so can all of our stations around the country where we are presently having to dub tapes, mail tapes, Federal Express back and forth, and shuffle. But with this way, we can put one brand new program on Westar 4 every Sunday morning. They can pick it up in the following week. It is played wherever, in all the stations at the same time across the country. So you can begin to have a currency, as it were, on the programs that you're doing every week. So we're pretty excited about that opening coming our way. We also think that it's possible. See, over the past years, we have had a number of stations, not about, thousands of them or anything like that, but we've had, maybe a dozen or so, in little bitty cable outlets here and there who expressed an interest in carrying our program. In some cases, they carried it free. In some cases, it was not even worth our mailing them a tape, believe it or not, for the pitiful response that we were getting back. It was more expensive for us to ship tapes down to some of these stations for them to play our broadcast than it was to buy time on better stations here and there around the country. So in many of those places, we just had to decline and say, I'm sorry, we just can't provide you with a tape now. Now we can tell them, sure, carry it. It's on, Westar 4 on Sunday morning. Pick it off and play it on your station. We're glad to have you do it. And this also means that some of our local churches in areas where very small cable systems serve them can possibly go down to their local cable company and talk to them and negotiate them locally, picking up the telecast off of that and playing it locally. So it should begin to get us a few outlets that we presently don't have. We're kind of excited about it and think it has a lot of things in store for us for the future. We have also picked up Birmingham, Alabama, 7 a.m. on Sunday morning. I think it's the CBS outlet. I'm not sure of the start date on that. Westar 4, by the way, begins next Sunday morning, 9 o'clock. So we're on our way with that one. We're actually using, I don't know if any of you here have satellite dishes by any chance? For those of you who do, on channel, Westar 4 Channel 2 is an old fellow out of Gravette, Arkansas, who has got a program that runs nearly around the clock all the time on Channel 2, and that's his only outlet as far as I know. And we're using his uplink to Westar 4, so it's kind of interesting. We're going to be shipping our tapes for uplink to Gravette, Arkansas, of all places. We have some other stations that are presently under negotiation. Benny was telling me yesterday of one that wanted $1,000, and he said, no way. And the guy said, well, how about $750? And he says, well, I'll get back to you. And he figures that we will be picking it up. But you have to kind of negotiate with these people. What they initially ask you is sort of like buying something in an Italian flea market. You'd think, well, they give you their price, that's their price, but it doesn't really work that way. If you ever are in an Italian flea market and you go in, you find something there, you should always offer half of what they're asking for it. You offer half of what they're asking for it, and they'll moan and groan and cry, and big tears may even. You can actually see tears rolling down their cheeks about how awful this is, and then if you begin to walk away, you probably will wind up getting it for half of what they originally asked you for it. So it's not quite that way with these radio stations, but it gets awfully close. Everything is there but the tears, and those might be there if you weren't just talking, if you see them, that you're on the telephone, you often don't know. Now, all this is happening not because we have lots of money, because we don't, really. The income is not up. In fact, the income is up, but it's not up like it was last year. It is tailing off a little bit in the percentage of increase this year. We're doing this because we feel we ought to do it, for we have to do it. It's not as though we're going to go down the tubes unless something happens, but we will probably have to make some adjustments unless something doesn't happen. But we do feel that one of the reasons why the income is not growing like it was a year ago is because we have not been adding new television stations like we were at the time when we had just gone on WTBS. That was one, not TBS, WGN was one big outlet, and our income improved tremendously after that. And we have not been doing that for a while. And as a result, the income shows it and reflects it. So we feel that for the future of the work and the sake of the future of the work, we have to begin doing our best to find some new outlets and new ways of getting the word out to the public at large, because not that we're in the business for the money. That isn't it, as I think all of you understand. But it is the income to the work which makes it possible for us to do more work. And so we have to use a pretty intelligent approach to it as we go along. That, however, is not the reason why you should give a good offering today. I want you to turn back with me, if you have your Bible handy, to Deuteronomy 16, the old reminder. 3 times in a year, in fact, some of you old heads could probably quote this from memory without any trouble at all. 3 times in a year shall all your males appear before the Lord your God in the place which he shall choose, in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in the Feast of Weeks, that's Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty, that is to say, empty-handed. Every man shall give by 2 criteria. 1, his ability, and 2, his blessing. This is a thank offering. It is something you give in response to God, according to your ability, and according to the blessings that God has given you during the past year. You know, I've thought a lot about this over time, and there's a thought that's been nagging the back of my mind for some little time. And I thought I would just talk briefly about it in the offering period today. There is a tendency on all of our parts to think in terms of, when it comes to giving an offering, well, we are going to give an offering to Tyler so that Tyler can put, more television programs on the air, and we believe in that, and so consequently we want to support that and get on with the work, and that's why I am giving an offering. I want you to understand that that is really not so. That's not the way to approach giving an offering on this day for this purpose. This is not an offering being given, quote, to Tyler, end quote. It is an offering being brought to God and given to him through his church. Now, all of you knew that, didn't you? All of you were fully aware of that. I'm not telling you a thing in the world that you don't know and haven't known for a long time. But just to give you a little parable, once upon a time, there was a little Jew. And he came up time to give an offering and was going to bring an animal down to the temple. And as he began to think in terms of going down there, he himself was not a young man, but he was a spare man. He was a very slim type person, had always been in his life, and a hard-working person. And he began to think about the priest whom he knew and had seen year after year, and how fat he was. And he thought in terms of, here I am going to go down here with this animal, this sheep that I have set aside for him, to give as an offering down to the temple, and I'm going to give that sheep to that fat priest, and he's going to eat it. Most of it, part of it, and it just galls me. It just galls me that I should be doing that in this case. And so he sits there and thinks to himself, I know what I will do. I have got another sheep over here that is not nearly so fat. It's a lot leaner than this one. And one of its eyes is not as bad, but we won't pay much sense. It's still a sheep. And I'm just going to take that down. I'm going to give it because, frankly, that priest doesn't deserve this good one. Now, I don't know what for sure God might have said to that little old Jew if he spoke to him at that time. But it might have been something like this. You have profaned it, in that you say, the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. Behold, you said also, what a weariness it is, and you have snuffed at it. And you brought that which was torn, and the lame, and the sick. And you brought an offering this way. Should I accept this of your hand? But cursed is the deceiver, which has in his flock a male and vows and sacrifice to the Lord a corrupt thing. For I am a great king, saith the Lord of hosts, and my name is dreadful among the heathen. Now I have no doubt that there were those who, when the time came to make an offering, did so, made an inferior offering out of greed. But I also know for a fact there were a lot of people, I just know human nature, I'm sure it is so, that there were a lot of people who made an inferior offering because of their attitude and because they had lost track of God lost sight of God as a part of the giving process, as the receiver of what it was they were giving. And so I just thought today that even though I am telling you about the needs of the work, I want to make a point that it is not for that purpose that you are giving. Now, the money may well go. Some of it will go there, and some of it will go for literature, and some of it will go for other things. But the fact of the matter is that when the time comes for us to give an offering, we are giving an offering to God for Him, because of our love for Him, because of our gratitude for what He has done for us, and out of the goodness of our hearts. So that's what I would like for you to think about today as you give your offering to God. Not our needs, because indeed they are not ours. The television program is not ours. The church is not ours, nor is it yours. It is God's, or it is nothing. And so in advance, thank you for your generosity, and thank you for preparing the offering that you have prepared today. When Israel had crossed the Red Sea and stood looking back at Pharaoh's armies pursuing them across the bottom of it, it no doubt was a very frightening experience. But then all of a sudden the waters began to cave in on both sides of them and rolled down upon the Egyptian armies in there. And of course the fear that they may have had was suddenly and dramatically transferred to the Egyptians as they saw and stared death in the face. And as the waters collapsed upon them, there would have been for some little time thereafter probably almost total stunned silence on the part of the Israelites who were looking back across that, for they realized that they had just seen the death of perhaps thousands of soldiers at that moment of time. The waters probably would have taken some little time to calm down. And as they watched, one person cheered, and then another. And someone stood up and yelled, put both arms in the air and screamed at the top of their voice, "We're free! We're free!" And you have to realize this festival that we are observing today is looked upon by all Jews as a festival of freedom. It's in a way their 4th of July, their Independence Day, but even more than that, it's their Emancipation Day. It's the day that they were liberated completely, once and for all, from slavery. And there were dances, and there were songs, and children capering up and down the beach of the Red Sea, and there were taunting songs about the Egyptian. There was the song of Moses that praised God for what he had done, how he had protected them and had made a dry path for them across the bottom of the Red Sea, but had drowned the Egyptian armies in the depths of the sea. But I have a feeling, as they watched and as they danced, that there were a couple of people who looked out across the Red Sea and said to themselves, yes, that sea has just sealed off the Egyptian army from us, but it has also sealed us off from Egypt. It has also sealed us off from employment, from food, from shelter, from a way of earning a living. And that same Egyptian army, which because we were fleeing was trying to kill us, was an army that kept anybody from bothering us. We had not to worry about going to war. We had no worry about defending ourselves. We had no worry about police, other than the Egyptian police themselves, for all those periods of time. There were people who thought that. And by the time the celebration was over, and a lot of them woke up the next morning with a head like a watermelon, and they began to reflect on the desert around them, and they began to realize that there was no water anywhere there to be seen. Reality began to settle in on those people's shoulders. I hearken back to a time in history in this state when a little later, perhaps, than other parts of the country, the Emancipation Proclamation was finally put into effect in Texas. The date was June 19th, otherwise known as Juneteenth here in Texas. A day of great celebration for the black community in Texas. What many people do not realize is that it was also a day of terrible disaster for black people in Texas, because there had been no preparation whatever for liberation in Texas. No one had really thought about what all these black people were going to do for a living. Nobody had given adequate consideration to their preparation for earning a living. Oh, they could give them land, I suppose. They could give them a place to work. But just supposing that all of a sudden this happened to them in June, so they weren't in too bad a shape in this way. But suppose it had happened to them in the wintertime, and they had no seed. And if they had had seed, planting it would mean it wasn't going to be around until next spring. How are they going to eat? Where are they going to find food? Where are they going to find work? Because the fact of the matter is that was a terrible economic dislocation to the state, an economic dislocation for which no preparation to speak of had been made, no adequate plans had been made, and it was, in a very real sense, an economic disaster for many black people in Texas. It all was for the good, I suppose, in the long run, as freedom always is. But you have to think about, along with freedom, go certain other things, certain other responsibilities, certain other situations, as it did for Israel, the day after they had crossed the Red Sea, the day after they had been sealed off from Egypt, and reality finally really began to set in. They came to a place called Marah that time. Chapter 15 of the book of Exodus, in verse 23. When they came to Marah, they found a spring there at last, and hope soared. But the instant they started to drink of the waters of Marah, they found they were poisoned, and the name of it was called Marah, or bitter. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast into the waters were made sweet. And there he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them, and said, "If you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, and you will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you, which I have brought upon the Egyptians. I am the Lord that heals you." And there came to Elim, and there were 12 wells of water, and 80 and palm trees, and they encamped there by the waters, and so finally they had water. But can you imagine the terror, the sheer, stark terror that came upon these people when they realized they were cut off from Egypt? They could not go back. They could not go back if they wanted to go back. There was no food in the land where they were other than what they had brought with them and carried on their backs and driven in front of them. And there was no water until they finally found a spring, and when they found it, it was poison. Terror. We're free. Isn't it wonderful? And the doubts began to set in. The fears were already present, and the concerns. And the leaders, the would-be leaders, began to talk about this and about the problem. And where are we going to get food? We got food with us. How long is it going to last? How long will it be before we have eaten up the supplies of fresh fruits that we have brought with us? How long will it be before all of our animals are gone? And people began to talk. But God cleaned up the water so they could drink. And he said, I'm going to make an agreement with you. If you will diligently hearken to the voice of your God and will do that which is right in His sight and give ear to His statutes and His commandments, then I'm not going to treat you like I treated the Egyptians. They had a small problem here as free men. They had someone with them who would protect them. They had someone with them who would feed them. They had someone with them who would see to it that they had water to drink and all those good things. There was only one problem. He said, if you will obey me, if you will fear me, if you will keep my commandments and my statutes, and if you will just do what is right in my sight. Is that worth freedom? Why, sure. Now, are you giving up some freedom right there? Oh, yeah. You sure are. You see, you walked out of Egypt and out of the slavery that was there, but in order to get out of that, you have to accept certain other obligations or starve. That's what it really boiled down to, you know. It was either accept some new responsibilities and obligations and accept them voluntarily as free men, or find your own water. Find your own food. And so they had to think on that for a little while. Then they took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month, after their departing out of the land of Egypt, 1 month later. And the whole congregation of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, I wish we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. I just wish we were dead. Let's go suck worms and die. Notice it says the whole congregation. This thing had infiltrated all of them. They were miserable. And of course they had plenty of help from those would-be leaders among them who kept reminding them all the time of these things. Instead of reminding them, well, God will take care of you. God will give us the blessing. God will provide for us. Let's trust God. Let's continue to be obedient to God. There were those who said, boy, you know, we had plenty to eat in Egypt. Okay, we had to work, but you got to work anywhere. At least we were alive in Egypt. We could have melons and leeks and garlics and fresh vegetables galore, and we had our own animals we could kill and eat. The Egyptians didn't want them, and we may have had to work hard, and I'm sure some of us died for it, but nevertheless, it was better there than here. Here we're all going to die of hunger, and we're all going to die of thirst. And so finally they all got to talking it up. And he goes on to say in verse 4, Thus saith the Lord, Then said the Lord to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people will go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I will prove them whether they will walk in my law or not. And here is this beautiful, we use it as an illustration. It was life and death to the Israelites who heard it. For us, it's an illustration of how God feeds His people and how God takes care of His people. And this chapter and the events taking place in it have been used by preachers of all denominations for hundreds of years as they expound God's blessing upon Israel and how He fed them when they came out of Egypt. And, of course, we have oftentimes turned to this chapter to point out how God put manna out on the land and they could go out and gather it every day. And then on Friday, they were to gather twice as much and keep it over and prepare it, so they would have something to eat on the Sabbath day, because there won't be any, he said, on the Sabbath day. Any other day they tried that, and it bred worms and stank. So that he just systematically taught Israel the Sabbath day and disciplined them to the Sabbath day, so that they would learn and get firmly in their minds what his intent was, where he was taking them, what his law was. And he says, all you have to do now is do what is right in my eyes, live a good life, live a clean life, keep my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, and you're going to have water, and you're going to have food. And so they did, even when they weren't just really keeping God's ways and doing everything that was right in His eyes. He still took care of them. And so we come on down to chapter 17. All the congregation of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim. And there was, once again, no water there for the people to drink. So the people chided with Moses and said, Give us water to drink. And Moses said, What are you jumping on me for? Why are you tempting God? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, Why is this that you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children, our cattle with thirst? You have done this. Now, to this day, I read that and I am utterly astonished. Here were a people who had seen all the plagues upon Egypt. They knew about the death of the firstborn. They had seen the pillar of fire. They had seen the pillar of smoke. They had crossed dry shod across the bottom of the Red Sea, and the water was like a wall on the left and a wall on the right. They had seen it collapse on the Egyptian armies. They had seen it, but as Moses would hold his arms up, the waters went back. They had seen Moses throw something in the water and turn it sweet at Marah. And they come to say, you brought us out of Egypt. How could they do that? You know, it is utterly incredible to me that they could. But they could, it seems, not see beyond Moses. Although I kind of wonder a little bit about it. Over the years, I've had occasion to see in people a reluctance to blame the one that they really hold accountable. I remember even in the old church organization how many people were so reluctant to put the finger of blame right where it belonged on the leader of the organization when certain things were done. So they would blame the one below him. They would blame Mr. Ted Armstrong, or they would blame this person, or they would blame that person, or they would blame, some of you remember a lawyer named Stan Rader, they'd blame him for it. They'd blame anybody except the man who was in charge. And I think I understand the human aspect of all of this, because the fact is, it's kind of hard to, in your mind, get around to saying the words, God made a mistake. It's hard to say to yourself, God brought us out here in the desert to die here. It couldn't possibly have been God's will. Moses has somehow gotten this wrong. Moses has made a wrong turn. Moses has led us in a wrong direction. Moses wasn't really supposed to bring us out of Egypt. The human mind is funny. You know, we can sit here nice and comfortable and warm and expecting a meal here in a few moments, and we can say to ourselves, well, anybody should have known that Moses could not have brought them out of Egypt at all. Anyone should have known Moses couldn't give them manna to eat. Anyone should have known that Moses couldn't have made the water sweet at Marah. But when you're there, and when you are afraid, and when you are thirsty, sometimes you don't make sense like you might. And so Moses went to God, crying, what shall I do? These people are almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said to Moses, go on before the people, and take with you of the elders of Israel, and your rod, wherewith you smote the river, take in your hand and go. Behold, I will stand before you upon the rock in Horeb, and you shall smite there the rock, and there shall come water out of it that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of all the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? There's a challenge, you know. Well, is God really here, or is God somewhere else? This sort of thing happened again and again and again among these people. And the lessons are all written down for us to consider and ponder, think over, and consider the implications of it. Now, you know, being free is indeed a wonderful thing, unless you're hungry, unless you're thirsty, unless you're afraid, right? Being free is wonderful unless you're afraid of whatever it is that might be coming your way. Now, when this happens, when you are in this situation, when you are indeed free, it means that you are free to question. It means that you are free to challenge. It means that you are free to speak. Now, how far do you suppose people would have gotten when they were living back in Egypt with overt criticism of Pharaoh? How far would they have gotten with speeches, making speeches about the oppression of the Egyptians and how bad it was that they had to make these bricks and how they wanted better work hours? Do you suppose that man might have disappeared some night? Or do you suppose he might have just been arrested in broad daylight and carted off, dragged in the dust, so everybody would see that this is what happens to people who criticize the government? Of course that's what would have happened. The Egyptians would not have stood still for it for one moment. But you see, these people were free. And along with freedom came, as I've already pointed out, a certain amount of fear and apprehension, a certain amount of thirst and hunger, and with it also came a certain amount of dissent. No one seems to have really been exempt from it. For example, when you come down to Numbers, which records a lot of the events of this time, in chapter 12 you find a fascinating illustration of it. Miriam and Aaron. Now this is really shocking once again, because here's Aaron, who is the high priest, and Miriam, a close relative, and here are people that are deeply involved in, and Miriam is a prophetess. I mean, it's not as though she's a no one that nobody ever heard of. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian or Cushite woman. Now, this is kind of interesting because Zipporah was not Cushite. This is not talking about her. It's talking about someone else. And whether or not it's talking about someone in Moses' past, I'm not sure, because it says he had married an Ethiopian woman. There is no indication anywhere in this history that she was even there or even involved in any of the goings-on. Now, Cushite people are black, as far as we know in the Bible. It's possible that they were not all entitled, but they definitely were of a different race from Israel. They were not Semitic. They were Hamitic in their descent. Of this, there can hardly be any doubt. There is not a suggestion here anywhere at all that Miriam and Aaron were not telling the truth. They just were concerned about this. They spoke against him. They actually spoke overtly against him because he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Has he not spoken also by us?" And the Lord heard it. Now, when I read this with kind of mixed feelings about it. For I hearken back to a lot of situations that I've heard of in the past where people would try to use something like this as a club to beat people about the head and shoulders with and say that you cannot, under any circumstances, criticize the leadership of the church. Is that the lesson to be drawn for this? Well, I don't know if I can go that far or not. When we think about it and we look at all the New Testament examples and Old Testament examples, we find an awful lot of criticism that isn't punished quite in the same way. There are several things I think we need to consider about this. One is, what had Moses done wrong? What was the criticism, really, that had been made against Moses in this situation? Well, they said, he's married a Cushite woman. Okay. Was this something in his past? Was he being disqualified for something he had done before he ever fled from Egypt in the first place? Had he done something brand new that had come along, of which we here are told absolutely nothing? What is the circumstance here? Was this somehow disqualifying of Moses that this had been done? I don't know, but here's the interesting thing. He said, "Has God indeed spoken only by Moses? Hasn't he also spoken by us?" In other words, can't God reveal his will as readily through me and you as he could through Moses? Not an illogical question, but this scripture doesn't stop here. It says, "Now the man Moses was very meek above all the men that were upon the face of the earth. And the Lord spoke suddenly unto Moses and Aaron and Miriam and said, I want you three out in the tabernacle of the congregation. And they came out. And the Lord came down in the pillar of a cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth. And he said, Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision, and I will speak to him in a dream. This is the way I normally work with a prophet. Now, but my servant Moses is not so. He is faithful in all my house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches. And the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Now there is an enormous difference between Miriam and Aaron on the one hand and Moses on the other. God had never spoken apparently to Miriam and Aaron. He had never spoken face to face. They were never allowed to see his similitude. Moses was. Now, Moses spoke in one of his prophecies about a time to come when the Lord would raise up another prophet like him whom the people should hear. All Christian commentators understand fully that that other Moses to come was none other than Jesus Christ. All of them understand that it is Jesus Christ who, for the church, sits in Moses' seat. That Moses was a type of Christ. Miriam and Aaron, nor any other prophet, as a matter of fact, that came along with the one exception of a man named David, no other prophet ever was a type of Christ in any aspect of his work or of his doings. David was a type of Christ. Moses was a type of Christ. No one else. And so when they took in hand to criticize Moses, what they were really doing was criticizing God. And you see, this is where the difference comes in. You may criticize me quite freely without any fear that you are criticizing God, unless it should happen to be that you really are. How could that be? It could be because of something that I had preached out of the Bible, something that I explained out of God's Word, something that I didn't get from myself. I got it here. I explained it to you. I gave you scriptures to back it up. But because it hurts, because it pinches, you find yourself resenting it, and you decide to resent me instead of resenting God. Could you suppose that could ever happen? Oh, yeah. It could happen very easily, as a matter of fact. Because who am I? You know, and what difference does it make if I should stand here and I should preach something that makes you feel uncomfortable? For the fact is, I don't know it makes you feel uncomfortable. She doesn't know it makes you feel uncomfortable. He doesn't know it makes you feel uncomfortable, whoever you are. Why then get upset with the preacher? See, one of the problems, and I have to go back in my own life and acknowledge that this has been true in my own case, that there have been times when I have resented God. I didn't realize that was what I was doing, and as soon as I did come to realize that was what I was doing, I repented of it. But I did realize that that basic, innate hostility that exists between a man and God can find expression in so many ways. Now, I don't feel terribly critical of Miriam and Aaron in this situation. They were wrong, and they paid for it. Miriam was smitten with leprosy, and she was healed, but she had to stay out of the camp for so many days before it was all said and done. And they got their very, very stern rebuke. But you see, you need to bear in mind where they were. And you need to bear in mind the pressures that all of them were under. You need to bear in mind the fear, the disquiet, the concern, the sometimes hunger, the oftentimes always boredom with the way of life that you live in the desert like that, wandering about from place to place, not planting crops, not harvesting crops. You know, these people had been wandering, and finally, before all was said and done, for 40 long years in the desert because of their weakness and their unwillingness to go in and fight for the land. And it got old. And they didn't have a lot of things to do besides politic, when you think about it. Why shouldn't there be politics among them? What else did they have to do? They didn't have crops to plant. They had to keep the herds kind of together, but that was about that. It just wasn't that kind of a life. You know, when you get into a land and you're planting your crops and you get the normal agricultural season going, you got things to look forward to. Let's travel to the Feast of Tabernacles and go down to the temple. Let's go down and make our sacrifices. All these things that people do in the normal life cycles, all that was different when they were wandering around in the wilderness, and there was a lot of time to politic and to get on your Shanks mare and go across to Isaac's tent over here and sit down and bend his ear for an hour or two or three or four, because after all, you're not interrupting his favorite television program. They could talk, and they could politic, and they did. Later, in chapter 14, they're mad about something else. The whole congregation this time is lifting up their voice, and they cried and wept all night long about some of these things. This was after they had learned how big the people were and how formidable they were in the land where they were supposed to go in and possess it. You know, Caleb and Joshua says, hey, let's go in. We can win. God is with us. We can overcome all these people. But the other men that went in said, boy, they were scared. They were scared out of their wits. Isn't it wonderful being free? Free men, you know. And here we are, us free men. We have got a land over here, and we're supposed to go in and take it. Us free men. And they were scared to death. And they said, we can't do it. They're too big for us. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. Caleb and Joshua, two men, said, no, we can do it. We can win. God is with us. And he said, when the people heard all this report, they lifted up their voice and cried, and they wept that night. And the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, the whole congregation, and said to them, would God we had died in the land of Egypt, or we just go ahead and die in this wilderness. And wherefore has the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return into Egypt? And they said one to another, let's make us a captain, and let's return into Egypt. They said one to another, let's go on back. And Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly of the congregation. And Joshua, the son of Nun, Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, which were among them, they tore their clothes. They spoke to the people. And after all was said and done, when they tried to persuade them, the people said, stone them with stones. Well, the plagues that came upon them and how that God, maintained His control over this congregation is a staggering thing to read. The whole stories are all there for you to read. And of course, a couple of chapters later, We have another story besides. We have now a master politician named Korah and two of his sons. And they think, well, look, they're just as good as Aaron. And so on it goes. These people, of course, finally, the earth opened up beneath them and swallowed them, and they died there. Now, I read all of this and go through these things, as we have done many times during this time of year, to remind ourselves of the origins of the days of unleavened bread, of Israel's departure out of Egypt. But there is a very powerful parallel with the New Testament. And I want you to turn back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Moreover, brethren, Paul writing to the Corinthians, fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized to Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual meat, and they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. He says they were baptized, Moses baptized them in the Red Sea. There is an intentional metaphor being drawn here by Paul, an analogy, between Israel crossing through the Red Sea and our being baptized. When you actually go into the waters of baptism, before you go in, you are a servant of sin. You are in bondage to sin. You are under sin and you are under the penalty of the law because you have broken the sin. And you are spoken of in the Bible as a slave. You go down in the waters of baptism and you symbolically die. The books are closed on you. Your death warrant is signed, filled out, filed away. Your death certificate is there. As far as you are concerned, you are dead to those who pursued you. When you come up out of the waters of baptism, like Israel come up out of the waters of the Red Sea, and you step out of the baptismal pool onto dry land again, and the waters close behind you, you are free. Absolutely free. And you may never have been more vulnerable at any other time of your life than on that day. Vulnerable. Vulnerable to what? Why should I be vulnerable? Well, you're vulnerable because you are free. Don't you understand? That freedom makes you vulnerable. That, for example, as a Christian, when you have come up out of the waters of baptism, you now belong to God. You have been taken away from Satan, and Satan, like human beings for that matter, wants what he can't have. And it's not at all uncommon for a person who has been baptized within a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, to find himself under an intense pressure that he has not felt ever before in his life and does not understand and is often confused by it. Because he thinks, I've been baptized. I have God's Spirit. Why am I going through this? You're vulnerable. Very vulnerable at that time of your life. And in fact, you really kind of remain that way for a long time to come. And because we are free, and because we are free men in a church, a lot of the same things happen to us that happened to Israel when they came out of Egypt. There is a concern about how are we going to eat and how are we going to drink. Oh, it's a spiritual concern, I'll grant you. But it is a concern, isn't it? How are we going to be fed? Where are we going to find, our daily sustenance? There is a concern about how we are led. We quickly can fall prey to politics, to people who begin to prey upon the fears that sometimes come upon us when we find ourselves free and don't know what we are to do next. And there is oftentimes among us a desire even to go back into Egypt, as it were, because we felt more secure there, because it was quieter there, because we were protected there, because life was better then. It happens to people. It happens to them very commonly. But Jesus gave us some warnings, some things that he said we ought to beware of. And I'd like for you to turn back to Matthew, the 7th chapter in the Sermon on the Mount, and look at some of Jesus' bewares, the things where he warned again and again, beware of this, beware of that. In Matthew, the 7th chapter, and verse 15, beware of false prophets that come to you in sheep's clothing. Inwardly, they are ravening wolves. Now, before you were baptized or before you knew anything about the church at all, were you particularly vulnerable to a false prophet during that period of time? Did you even really care about preachers one way or the other? Did it really make much difference who you heard or what have you? I mean, before you came to Christ. But once you have come to Christ, once you begin to be exposed to His Word, then you begin to realize there are all sorts of people who are prepared to teach you out of this Word at the drop of a hat. Do you think you would have trouble finding someone to teach the Bible to you? You just haven't tried. First place, all you have to do is punch your way across your television set on Sunday morning, and you'll find loads of people ready, waiting, actually slavering to teach you out of this book. You go to any church in the country. Oh, sure, there will be the pastor, but you won't attend very long before you'll find somebody in the congregation who would like to explain something to you out of the book, or begin to explain or to teach. It's why James warned people, said, look, brethren, don't try to be teachers. You need to understand that teachers are going to be judged with special strictness, and he was warning and trying to plead with the church, be careful about this thing, about being taught by everybody and anybody, anytime, any place. Never any shortage of teachers. And so you have to realize that the new Christian, and even the old Christian, is more vulnerable, and one of our vulnerabilities is false prophets. Now, what do you do about that? Well, Jesus said, they come to you in sheep's clothing. As far as the way they look, you can't really often tell the difference. But you shall know them, and you know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns, or do they gather figs from thistle trees? Every good tree brings forth good fruit. A corrupt tree brings forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that brings not forth good fruit is cut down and cast into the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits you shall know them. There's only one thing wrong with that. There's only one limiting factor, I should say, with it. Do you have any idea how long it takes sometimes to see fruit? I've got a peach tree and a pear tree I planted out. It's been there a couple of years now, and I've seen blossoms on the peach tree, no blossoms on the pear tree, and no fruit on either. And even when they get to the place to where they bear fruit, you only see fruit at certain seasons, don't you? You don't necessarily see it any time, all the time. And the tree can blossom, but even when it blossoms, you may not be entirely sure what you're going to get on it. One person I knew said he had seen a tree where they'd done grafting in it, and the thing produced lemons, limes, oranges, and grapefruits on the same tree because of grafts that somebody had done in the tree. Eventually, all that supposedly changes somewhere downstream, but you can't always tell for sure what you're going to get. The problem is that sometimes it takes time before you understand who you're dealing with and what he's teaching you. It's one of the reasons why, in my own feeling, I tend to feel this way, that the old preachers tend to be the better ones. The ones that have been around for a long time. Now, by better, I don't mean necessarily better in the sense that they can rattle the windows and shake the walls and all this type of thing. But the key is there has been a lot of time to see where they stand, what they produce, what they believe, how they react, how they deal with people, whether they are kind-hearted and generous or not, or whether they tend to be harsh and impatient with people. Lots of opportunities to see and weigh results. I can hearken back. One of the reasons that I feel the way I do is because I can look at myself and see a very, very different minister over a span of 25 years. In fact, in a way, I can see probably 3, 4, 5 different ministers in me alone over the period of time that I have preached. And I have to realize that a great deal of the work that I did in the earliest years of my ministry may well have been wood, hay, and stubble. May well have been. And when a day comes along and tries it, it's all going to be burned up, to use Paul's analogy. I also believe, though, that in the later years that some of what I have built has been gold and silver and precious stones, and I think it's going to survive. And I think that whenever trials and tests come along and it is tried by fire, that work will survive. And I have to realize that some of the things like this take time. Now, I would say if I were, a new Christian, I would want to take a look at those people who had been doing this for a long time. I would want to take a look at their work and take a look at their fruits, because there has been plenty of time to evaluate what they have done. But then some new person comes along, maybe he is being trained, maybe he is being taught, and I might be a little spooky about this new person. What am I going to do? Well, the way it is set up in the Church of God International is you look to the ones that have been around a little while to validate, examine, and test the ones who haven't. In other words, it is the existing ministry, and in particular the ministerial council, who are the more experienced ministers of this church, who eventually, as it were, pass judgment on the younger ministers, the newer ministers, the ones who are being trained for the ministry and what have you in the Church of God International, and hopefully can help you evaluate the fruits of such a one as time goes by. This is one of the things that, that Moses, as God sent him, was responsible for, was providing leadership for the people, so that people like Korah, Dathan, and Abiram would not pull away disciples to their own hurt and to the hurt of the disciples and everyone concerned in it. So they wouldn't cause Israel to infuriate God to the extent that if Moses had not laid his own life on the line, God would have wiped Israel off the face of the earth because of the work of people like Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Don't you think that could happen? Oh, it almost did. It almost did. God got Moses off by himself, and when he heard what all these people were doing, very early, he says, "Let me alone. I'm going to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and I'm going to start this whole thing over again with you." That's what he said. Moses said, "Well, then blot my name out of your book." Now that is this from a meek man. I always shake my head when I come to that verse. This is supposed to be a meek man. And when God gave him the chance of being the patriarch of Israel, nobody would even hear of Israel anymore. It would be the descendants of Moses we'd all be talking about. If God had done what he said he was going to do. And I'll have to tell you, I cannot bring myself to believe for a moment that God ever bluffs. I do not believe he was bluffing. I believe he was ready to do it. Now, I shudder to say some of the things that I'm saying today, as I said earlier, because of abuses that we have seen in the past. But here is this scripture that you can always lean on. You can always depend on it. By their fruits you shall know them. You may not always know everything there is to know about a church leader. You may not always be able to evaluate every aspect of his life. There may from time to time be things that you're not quite sure you would approve of. But then again, do you really know? Do you really understand? You're not called upon to judge oftentimes by the things that by hearsay and rumor. You're just not called upon to judge by these things. You're called upon to judge by the fruits. You do have to do that. Because here it is. He said, beware, look out for, watch out for false prophets. He approved of the Ephesian church testing those who said they were apostles and were not, and determining that they were liars. He said, it is right that you have done this. Jesus said, you are vulnerable. Beware. Look out for false prophets. A little later in Matthew chapter 10, he gives them another warning of things of which they should beware. Matthew 10 and verse 17. Beware of men. Just in general, just look out for men. He said, because they will deliver you up to councils. They will scourge you in their synagogues. You shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. You and I have never had to face up to this kind of persecution yet. But he says, when I'm talking about the vulnerability of the new, free Christian, they were vulnerable to people inside the church, false prophets who might come along and try to deceive them. They were vulnerable to people who had nothing to do with religion, who just wanted to stamp out this pestilent sect. Beware of men. They will deliver you up to be persecuted. Chapter 16 of Matthew, a scripture very apropos to the day that begins today. Matthew 16 and verse 6. Then said Jesus unto them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. They reasoned among themselves, saying, what is this? Is he saying this because we didn't bring any bread? Why is he warning us to beware of the leaven and of the Pharisees? He said, O ye of little faith, you don't need to reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread. Don't you know that I could have given you all kinds of bread? Don't you know what I've just done about bread? How many loaves of bread did you have to start with? How many baskets full did you take up when we multiplied it? Then finally, he said, how is it you don't understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, that you should beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Then he understood how that he bade them not beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It seems to me, and I've been at this now for a long time, that there will never be, a shortage of people who are prepared to introduce leavening into the church. New doctrine, and oftentimes false doctrine, and the desire for it. I don't know if you know how sourdough bread is made. But if you have no starter, if you, in the case of Israel, had gotten rid of all of your starter back when, you're going to have to leave bread out so that yeast can fall upon the bread. And, it's in the atmosphere at all times. It's always there. And you can leave it out. Yeast will fall upon it, or the bread will sour. Bacteria will begin to form in it. And you can eventually create and make leavened bread once again. Although normally it is done by keeping a piece of starter dough from the last batch and putting that in the new dough so that it begins to spread throughout it. But you can start from scratch, and it will be there. It will come as a result of just being in the air. And it's almost like the church is almost like that, because it is put out into the atmosphere, as it were, and there is constantly falling upon it, there are yeast and bacteria and so forth, and the potential for going sour is there day in, day out, day in, day out. If there isn't somebody wanting to put a new piece of dough into it, it just seems to happen almost spontaneously among people. And Jesus said, look out for this leaven, because you've got to be careful about it. You can become leavened again so quick, it is ridiculous. You go to all this trouble to get unleavened, the next thing you know, here it is again. And I have resigned myself to it as a minister. It's been so many years. I know that until the day that I die, I will be dealing with new leaven. It won't be the leaven of the Pharisees. It will be something else that someone trying to introduce into the church. And, of course, there will be times when those of us who are resisting that incursion will be viewed upon as obstructionists, hardheads, self-willed, egotistical. Let's see, we run a few more of the different kinds of adjectives by. And the funny thing about it is that there is no greater joy to me than discovering something new about God and about His way and about His plan that I never knew before. There is no greater joy, really. And I really hope in my heart of hearts that I would not care where it came from. And I certainly fear to ever resist the truth of God out of nothing more than pure orneriness or cussedness. I would hate that. But yet, sooner or later, someone will come along with a new idea. And the new idea has to be tested. And the new idea comes up wanting, and you're going to be perceived as hard-headed, obstructionist. Much like Miriam and Aaron saw Moses, much like Korah, Dathan, and Abiram saw Moses, not to even begin remotely put myself or Mr. Armstrong in a position, or a Moses-like position in the church. We are not and never will be. But it is our job to try to see to it that we don't become leavened with a doctrine like that of the Pharisees. Jesus warned us, look out for it, because it is something that will always be hanging around the edges. Where is your real defense, do you suppose, about all this? We have been pointing you in recent years more and more to an awareness of the days of unleavened bread as the time in which we partake of that sweet bread. And that is the term that is used in the Old Testament for unleavened bread, is sweet bread. Leavened bread is sour bread. Unleavened bread is sweet bread, because of the way in which the dough was made. It is unfermented. It is sweet. It's also called the bread of affliction. And the fact is that being free is sweet. But right along with being free goes a considerable amount of affliction. And we have said in more recent years that the days of unleavened bread do not so much picture putting sin out of your life, because we're supposed to have finished that yesterday. That is, getting all the leavening out of our homes. Now, for 7 days, we are supposed to be eating the sweet bread, the sweet unleavened bread, which represents Jesus Christ, which we daily must renew in our life. In the 15th chapter of the book of John, Jesus talks about a relationship that has to exist between us. And this is the salvation of the free man in Christ. The 15th chapter of John. I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that bears not fruit, He takes away. Every branch that bears fruit, He purges it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now you are clean through the word that I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I in you. This is not just a side-by-side relationship. Let's understand that. We're not merely dealing with the fact that, Jesus is right here, and I'm going to stay with Jesus like I would have stayed with Moses. Moses was a man. He was another man. I am a man. I could follow him around wherever he went. That is one relationship that can exist. What Jesus is saying should exist between us is that we should be in Him and He should be in us. It is that the representation symbolically of partaking of bread and wine together, where He made a covenant with us. and we enter into a relationship with us, and that Christ in us is not vulnerable at all. That's where your protection comes from, in the freedom that you have and can enjoy in Jesus Christ. You stay in me, and I will stay in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself except it stays in the vine, no more can you except you stay in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. He that stays or remains in me, and I stay in him, the same brings forth much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. One of the things that I think we have come to understand in the days of unleavened bread, at least to me it seems so obvious that it's hard to miss. You receive Christ, and you go through the Passover service, which we did night before last, and you partake of his broken body and of his shed blood, and the idea of receiving Christ into yourself is well established. Also, what seems to go along with it, in our minds at least, is that is kind of like a once-for-all type of thing. We do it once, and it's done, and that's that. But you see, then come the days of unleavened bread, where every single day of the festival, 7 days in a row, we are supposed to partake of unleavened bread, which at the Passover symbolized receiving Christ, didn't it? Why does it mean something else today? Once again, it is a reminder that every single day of our life, we must, as free men, receive and renew the relationship with Jesus Christ. Every day of our life. It's almost as though it drains away a little bit at a time. For it seems that you cannot just simply enter into this relationship and then ignore it and expect that relationship to continue. Does that make any sense that it would? Of course not. It makes all the sense in the world that the relationship would have to be renewed. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, you shall ask what you will, and it shall be done. Think about that one for a while. What can you do with that promise? Where can you go with that promise? Can you live by that? Can you bank on that? Can you trust that? Finally, turn back to 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul has encountered a situation in the Corinthian church, one more vulnerability of Christians, the vulnerability to sin. And oh, aren't we vulnerable? It isn't that we sin more now that we have been baptized. It is that now sin brings with it the full consequences. Now it brings with it the awareness. Now we are convicted. And it's entirely possible for a person who's been baptized last week to feel like he's a worse sinner this week than he was before he was baptized and say, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? I seem to be worse now than I was before. I've heard people ask that very question. It is because God's Spirit is in you and convicting you of sin. He says to them when he's talked to them about this individual in the church who was involved in incest with his father's wife, he told them basically to put him out of the church. And he says in verse 5, purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump as you are unleavened. Which in itself would be a contradictory phrase if it is, speaking completely and metaphorically of leaven. He is speaking metaphorically and he is speaking literally of leaven. Purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, metaphorically, as you are unleavened literally in your homes. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and of wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And if we could just come to understand those two words. Understand them, live them. To partake of the feast with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. What do those things mean? Sincerity, truth. Doesn't sincerity mean saying what you mean and meaning what you say? Doesn't it mean that you don't dissemble or pretend or engage in hypocrisy with other people? What do you mean truth? Speaking truth. I really wonder sometimes that some of us really understand the difference between opinion and truth. Our judgment and truth. What we have heard and truth. You know, if you were called into a trial courtroom nowadays and you were put on the stand and they had you put up your hand and said, do you affirm that you'll tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? And you say, I affirm that I will tell the truth. And they put you down there and they say, now, sir, we would like to know from you what you know about the situation with Jim Baker and what's her name? Say, well, what I heard was from the paper. I mean, my understanding is that 7 years ago, Mr. Jim Baker had a liaison with this young lady, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the next thing that the attorney is going to ask you is, how do you know this? Well, I read it in the National Enquirer. And the other attorney is going to say, objection. The judge is going to say, sustained. And we're going to call upon you to tell us what you really do know. And you're going to say, well, I guess, sir, I don't really know anything about it. That is the truth. That is the truth. I don't really know. Now, if we want to talk about opinions and judgments and ideas and thoughts and all that, we could spend a lot of time going into those things, couldn't we? But he said what we're looking for here is the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And it would be nice, and I've often thought about that. I have to realize that if we could just really partake of that, make that a way of life with us, how it would handle, how it would solve, and how it would resolve so many of the difficulties that arise among us and between us as Christians. I can't help but remember one young man in college who had been taught this idea that, well, it's important that we be open, with one another. We just really got to be open. And he'd stewed on it for a while, and one night he went and knocked on the door of a fellow student's room. The student opened the door, he saw him standing there, and he looked at him right in the eye and he said, I hate your guts. The other student said, well, taken back, of course, he said, come on in, let's talk about it. They solved their problem. And they finally got to be fast friends. I don't recommend that you approach it that way, but I will say this. It was sincere, and it was the truth. You could do worse.